Imagine standing on land you've known your entire life, not because you visited it once or saw it in old photos, but because every fence post, every dirt road, every sunrise and sunset on that ground feels familiar in your bones. The kind of place where you don't need a map because your feet already know where to go. The kind of land where your memories aren't stored in albums but in the soil itself. Now imagine that sense of certainty being challenged in the most unreal way possible. It starts as an ordinary day. No dramatic music, no warning signs, just another quiet morning on a ranch where routine matters. Livestock need checking, gates need closing, work needs doing. Then, out of nowhere, a patrol car pulls up. Lights aren't flashing, sirens aren't blaring. It's calm, almost polite. Two officers step out, not hostile, not aggressive, just professional. They greet you by name. That alone feels strange. They already know who you are. One of them clears his throat and says something that doesn't immediately register. It sounds like a sentence, but your brain rejects it. He explains that they've received a complaint regarding the property. Not a noise complaint, not trespassing, ownership. According to the report, the land you're standing on doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to a homeowners association, an HOA. At first, you think there's been a mistake, a clerical error. Maybe they're at the wrong address. You glance behind you, half expecting to see a row of suburban houses, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes. But all you see is open land, fencing, cattle, and the same horizon that's been there for generations. You tell them that. You explain calmly that this is a working ranch, privately owned family land. You've got deeds, records, history. The officers listen. They nod. And then they say the words that change the temperature of the moment entirely. We understand. But the HOA claims this property is theirs, and they've provided documents. Documents. That word hangs in the air longer than it should, because suddenly this isn't just a misunderstanding between neighbors. It's not even a personal dispute. It's the system entering the conversation. Paper versus reality. Ink versus soil. And for the first time, something uncomfortable creeps in. Not fear, not anger, but disbelief. An HOA? Here? On this land? You ask when this association was formed. The answer doesn't help. You ask how land that's existed as a ranch for over a century could somehow fall under neighborhood governance. The officers don't speculate. They don't accuse. They simply explain that they're responding to a claim and that the HOA alleges illegal occupation of community-controlled land. That phrase, illegal occupation, feels absurd, offensive, almost surreal. You're not squatting. You're not trespassing. You're not some outsider. This land predates the idea of the community claiming it, and yet here you are, being told, calmly, professionally, that someone else has asserted authority over it. The most unsettling part isn't the accusation itself, it's the confidence behind it. Someone filed this complaint knowing it would trigger a police response. Someone believed, or wanted others to believe, that this claim could stand up in the real world. That confidence plants a seed of doubt, not about your ownership, but about how far this might go. You offer to show proof, deeds, tax records, surveys. The officers say that won't be necessary right now. They're not here to seize anything, not yet, but they inform you that the HOA has requested further action and that a legal process may follow. They advise you, almost sympathetically, to contact a lawyer. That's when the shock fully sets in. Not because you doubt your rights, but because you realize something important. This isn't going to be resolved by common sense. No one is going to look around and say, this doesn't make sense. This is going to be fought in meeting rooms, filings and hearings, on paper. And paper, when weaponized, can do real damage. As the officers leave, the ranch feels different. Not physically, nothing has changed, but psychologically. The land that once felt unquestionable now feels contested. Not because it truly is, but because someone has dared to say it is. And that's a powerful thing. Accusations don't need to be true to cause disruption. They just need to be official enough. You start replaying the conversation in your head. The words OA and ownership feel incompatible, like pieces from two different puzzles forced together. Homeowners associations manage shared spaces. sidewalks, clubhouses, rules about paint colors and fences. They don't claim working ranches. They don't rewrite history. Or at least, they're not supposed to. But this one has tried. And suddenly, the mystery opens up wider than the accusation itself. Who would make a claim this bold? Why now? What do they stand to gain? This isn't a boundary dispute over a few feet of land. This is a claim over everything, over control, over authority, over value. The injustice hits harder the longer you think about it. Not because you're powerless, you know you're not, but because the burden has shifted. You're no longer simply living on your land. You're defending it. You're expected to prove what was never in doubt. And that reversal feels deeply wrong. Viewers feel it too, because almost everyone understands on some level what it means to feel secure in something they've earned or inherited. A home, a business, a piece of stability. And the idea that someone could challenge that, not with force but with paperwork, taps into a very real fear. A fear that the systems meant to protect order can sometimes be bent to create chaos. The question stops being, is this true? And becomes, how did this even get this far? How does an HOA believe it has the authority to call the police on a ranch owner? How does a claim like this pass through enough channels to land on your doorstep in uniform? And most importantly, if this can happen here, where else can it happen? That's the hook. Not just the shock of the accusation, but the realization that this story isn't about one ranch or one HOA. It's about how easily reality can be challenged when confidence, paperwork, and authority collide. It's about the thin line between ownership and control. And it's about what happens next, when someone decides they're not going to quietly accept an impossible accusation, because once that seed is planted, once the question is asked, there's no going back to normal. There's only forward, into conflict, discovery, and a confrontation that will decide who actually holds power when truth meets bureaucracy. At first glance, it didn't look like a real fight. That was the most unsettling part. There were no corporate logos, no government seals stamped across official buildings, no army of lawyers lined up in glass offices downtown. There was no towering institution casting a shadow over everything I owned. Instead, there were just a few names on letterhead. A small group of people who met once a month in a community hall, who argued about parking rules and fence heights, who signed emails with friendly closings and titles that sounded harmless. And yet, those were the people now claiming control over land that had existed long before any of them had arrived. That realization marked the beginning of a quiet shift in power, not outwardly visible, not dramatic, but deeply consequential. Because this wasn't a battle of strength or money. It was a battle of belief, belief in paper, belief in process, belief that authority doesn't come from history or labor, but from whatever document happens to be recognized in the moment. I wasn't fighting a corporation or the government. I was fighting a handful of people who believed paperwork mattered more than a century of history. And the more I thought about it, the more dangerous that belief became. They didn't see themselves as villains. That much was clear. In their minds, they were simply enforcing rules, managing assets, protecting community interests. That language gave them confidence. It wrapped their actions in legitimacy. And when people believe they're acting within a system, they stop questioning the impact of what they're doing. They stop seeing the human cost. From the outside, I looked like the one with power. I owned land. I worked it. I lived independently, far from neighborhood politics. But power isn't always about what you have. It's about who decides what counts. And in this situation, the HOA believed they were the ones who got to decide. That's how the underdog position forms quietly, not through poverty or weakness, but through isolation. I didn't have a committee. I didn't have a board. I didn't have a mailing list or monthly meetings where narratives were reinforced. I had facts, records, and a lifetime of lived reality that suddenly had to compete with neatly stapled packets and confident assertions. The HOA, small as it was, had something I didn't: internal agreement. They believed their own story. Every email they sent reinforced it. Every meeting they held echoed it. When a group repeats something often enough, it starts to feel true, even when it isn't. And that collective certainty is powerful. It gives even the weakest claim momentum. What made it worse was how ordinary they looked. These weren't shadowy figures operating in secrecy. They were familiar faces, neighbors, people who waved as they drove by, people who talked about doing what's best and following the rules. That normalcy made it harder to confront them, because conflict with institutions is easier than conflict with people who look like you. But beneath that calm surface was a willingness to override history, to erase decades of ownership with a single assertion. And that willingness didn't come from strength. It came from confidence that no one would challenge them properly. That's when curiosity replaces shock. Not curiosity about whether they're right, you already know they're not, but curiosity about how far they're willing to go. Because when small groups gain a taste of authority, especially unearned authority, they tend to test its limits. They push boundaries to see what they can get away with. And often, they rely on the assumption that the person on the other side will back down. That assumption becomes their biggest mistake. The imbalance wasn't in resources, but in expectations. They expected resistance to be emotional, angry, unfocused. They expected protests, not preparation. They expected denial, not documentation. And most of all, they expected compliance once pressure was applied. What they didn't expect was patience. Quiet power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue loudly or rush into confrontation. It observes. It listens. It takes notes. And while the HOA was busy reinforcing its narrative internally, I was doing something far less visible and far more effective. I was learning how they thought. Every letter they sent revealed assumptions. Every claim they made exposed gaps. They leaned heavily on authority language, regulated, designated, governed, but rarely explained the foundation of those claims. That told me something important. They believed structure alone was enough, that if something looked official, no one would question it deeply. That's where sympathy naturally grows for the underdog, because the fight isn't fair the way people expect. It's not landowner versus developer. It's one individual versus a collective that speaks with one voice, however small that collective may be. And when systems are involved, collectives often get the benefit of the doubt. Viewers recognize this dynamic instantly. Most people have experienced it in some form. An office policy enforced by a committee, a rule no one can fully explain, a decision justified by procedure rather than reason. They know how frustrating it feels to argue with something that doesn't have a single face. And that's why the HOA, despite being small, feels dangerous. Not because of physical threat, but because of procedural momentum. They file something. It triggers a response. That response triggers another. Suddenly, a claim becomes a process, and a process becomes pressure. And pressure, applied long enough, can break people, even when they're right. The quiet power shift happens the moment you realize that truth alone isn't enough. That's a sobering realization, because it forces a choice, either retreat into disbelief or adapt. Either assume fairness will prevail on its own or actively prepare to demonstrate it. This is where intelligence begins. To matter more than authority. Not book intelligence alone, but strategic thinking. Understanding that systems don't respond to emotion, they respond to structure. And if the HOA is using structure as a weapon, then structure has to become the battlefield. The underdog story resonates because it flips expectations. People assume power flows downward from large institutions, but here, power is being exercised upward by something smaller, something less visible, something operating in the gaps between oversight and assumption. That's unsettling, and it keeps viewers watching because they want reassurance that such power can be challenged, and it can, but not loudly. The true shift happens internally, long before anything changes on the outside. It's the moment you stop asking, why are they doing this, and start asking, how are they doing this? That question transforms confusion into strategy. It turns frustration into focus. It reframes the conflict from personal attack to structural weakness. Once you see it that way, the HOA stops looking invincible. They start looking exposed. Their strength, confidence in paperwork, also becomes their vulnerability. Because paper can be examined, traced, questioned. History, when properly documented, doesn't disappear just because someone claims it does. Viewers stay engaged because they sense this shift even if it isn't spelled out yet. They feel the story moving from reaction to intention, from shock to preparation. They want to how someone without institutional backing navigates a system designed to favor organized groups. This isn't about yelling at meetings or refusing to cooperate. It's about understanding that authority only works when it's accepted without scrutiny. The moment scrutiny enters the picture, authority has to justify itself. And not all authority can. That's the quiet power shift. Not a takeover, not a victory, just a change in posture. A realization that being underestimated can be an advantage, that being alone can mean being flexible, and that intelligence, applied patiently, can slowly drain the confidence out of even the most self-assured group. Because when people believe paperwork matters more than history, they rarely expect history to answer back. The documents arrived quietly, the way dangerous things often do, not with urgency or threat, but with formality, clean envelopes, clear language, confident formatting. At a glance, they looked exactly like what people expect official paperwork to look like: structured, precise, final, the kind of documents that make most people uncomfortable, not because they understand them, but because they assume someone else already has. That assumption is where the lie lives. Every claim they made rested on those pages. Every accusation. Every assertion of authority, every confident statement that the land somehow belonged to them, traced back to ink on paper. They didn't argue with history directly. They didn't deny the ranch existed. They simply overlaid a different story on top of it, one that appeared legitimate because it followed the visual language of legitimacy. At first, nothing jumped out. That was intentional. These weren't sloppy forgeries or handwritten notes. They were typed, referenced, cross-cited. They used legal phrasing that sounded familiar, even if it wasn't fully understood. Words like designation, master plan, community authority, and recorded amendment appeared often enough to create a sense of inevitability. Reading them felt like walking into a maze designed by someone who assumed you wouldn't try to find the exit. That's how paper lies work. They don't scream. They persuade by exhaustion. They rely on the idea that most people won't slow down long enough to question them, that they'll assume complexity equals truth. So instead of reacting, I slowed down. I read them the way you read something when you're not trying to win an argument, but trying to understand a trick. Line by line, not for what they claimed, but for how they claimed it. Noticing patterns, repetition, the way certain phrases were reused across different documents, almost copy-pasted, as if consistency itself were proof. Viewers lean in here, even if they don't realize it, because this part of the story invites them to participate. It turns passive watching into mental investigation. They start scanning for cracks alongside you. They begin asking the same question. If this is fake, where would it fail? At first, the documents referenced older records, dates that went back decades. That alone raised a quiet question. Not suspicion yet, just curiosity. The ranch had changed hands legally before. Those transactions were well documented. County records, tax filings, surveys. If the HOA's claims were true, they would have to intersect with that paper trail somewhere. There would be overlap, a visible collision between two versions of history. But there wasn't tea. Instead, there were references to filings that didn't quite land. Deed numbers that seemed plausible but oddly isolated. Survey descriptions that sounded right but felt generic, as if written by someone who understood the format but not the land itself. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. Real documents tend to carry the fingerprints of their environment. Fake ones often carry the fingerprints of templates. Then there was the detail that didn't add up. It wasn't dramatic. No single smoking gun, just something small enough that it could have been ignored. A date that didn't align with the technology implied by the description. a mapping reference that used terminology not commonly in use at the time it claimed to originate. To most people, it would have meant nothing. To someone familiar with how land is Ali measured, recorded, and described, it was a pause. That pause is powerful, because once doubt enters, the entire structure becomes unstable. You go back and reread with new eyes. What once felt authoritative now feels performative. You start seeing how the documents lean on implication rather than evidence, how they assume acceptance rather than invite verification. The confidence that once felt intimidating now feels rehearsed. This is where tension deepens without escalating. There's no confrontation yet, no raised voices, just a growing awareness that something is wrong and that the wrongness is deliberate. The HOA didn't invent chaos. They invented certainty, and certainty is far more persuasive. The documents didn't ask questions, they answered them preemptively. They didn't acknowledge ambiguity, they erased it. That's not how honest records behave. Real records are messy. They reference disputes, corrections, amendments. These didn't. They told a clean story in a world where land ownership is never clean. As you dig deeper, another pattern emerges. The documents rely heavily on each other. One references another. That one references a third. It creates a closed loop of authority. If you only read within the packet, everything appears consistent. But consistency isn't the same as truth. It's just repetition. That realization keeps viewers hooked, because it mirrors something familiar. People have seen this before. Contracts that reference policies that reference. CE guidelines no one can find. Rules that exist because they're written somewhere, not because they make sense. This isn't just about land anymore. It's about how systems protect themselves with language. And then there's the most unsettling part, how easy it would be to miss all of this. If you were tired, if you were overwhelmed, if you assumed that someone else had already checked. The paper lie doesn't rely on ignorance, it relies on trust. Trust that the system wouldn't allow something false to reach this point. Trust that documents wouldn't exist if they weren't valid. Trust that complexity equals legitimacy. But complexity can also be camouflage. As the investigation deepens, the story becomes less about proving ownership and more about exposing construction. How was this narrative built? Who assembled these documents? What knowledge did they have and what gaps did they exploit? Because no lie like this survives without understanding the rules well enough to bend them. That's what makes it intellectually engaging rather than emotionally explosive. There's satisfaction in unraveling something methodically, in watching confidence erode not through accusation, but through examination. Viewers stay because they want to see the moment when the illusion collapses, not with a bang, but with a quiet realization that the foundation was never solid. Every new inconsistency sharpens that anticipation. A map scale that doesn't match the described acreage, a boundary descriptor. On that, ignores natural markers any real surveyor would reference. Language that sounds legal but avoids specificity when specificity would be unavoidable. The lie reveals itself not by what it includes, but by what it avoids. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The documents stop feeling heavy. They start feeling hollow. Their authority drains away as you recognize them for what they are, props, designed to intimidate, not to withstand scrutiny. This is the moment where viewers understand something crucial. The HOA's power was never in the land. It was in the assumption that no one would look too closely, that the appearance of order would be mistaken for legitimacy, that resistance would be emotional, not analytical. The tension here doesn't come from danger. It comes from proximity to exposure, from knowing that the lie is fragile, but only if handled correctly. One wrong move, one premature accusation, and the HOA could retreat behind procedural noise. But patient examination turns their strength into a liability. That's why this section works so well for retention. It invites viewers to slow down rather than check out, to think rather than react, to experience the satisfaction of discovery. They aren't watching someone fight, they're watching someone dismantle. And as the paper lie begins to unravel, a new question replaces the old one. It's no longer, is this claim true? It's what happens when the people who rely on paperwork realize someone is actually reading it. That question carries the story forward, pulling viewers toward the next phase, not with adrenaline, but with anticipation. The moment authority entered the story in an official way, everything changed. Until then, it had felt like a dispute that could still be corrected with enough clarity, an error that would collapse once examined. But when the HOA involved law enforcement, it became clear this wasn't about confusion anymore. It was about leverage, about testing which version of reality the system would accept when two stories collided. What made it unsettling wasn't aggression, it was restraint. The officers weren't hostile, they weren't loud, they weren't acting on impulse. They were calm, procedural, careful. And that calmness made the situation far more dangerous than shouting ever could. Because calm authority carries weight. It signals legitimacy even when the foundation underneath it is shaky. That's when frustration begins to replace disbelief. Not the kind of frustration that explodes, but the kind that tightens. The realization that truth doesn't automatically rise to the top. That being right doesn't mean being believed. That systems don't investigate feelings, they process inputs, complaints, reports, documents. The HOA understood this. They weren't trying to convince me, they were trying to trigger mechanisms. They didn't need to prove ownership beyond doubt. They only needed to sound credible enough to move the issue out of the realm of private disagreement and into official channels. Once that happened, the burden quietly shifted. Now it wasn't just my land versus their claim. It was my account versus a formally logged complaint. My history versus their paperwork. And the system, by design, doesn't choose sides based on intuition. It chooses based on procedure. That's where outrage builds for viewers. Not because of what law enforcement did, but because of how easily authority can be redirected. The officers weren't villains. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do. Respond to a report, assess the situation, document it, and advise next steps. The problem wasn't the response. The problem was how the response was initiated. Someone had weaponized the process. That realization is deeply unsettling because it's relatable. Most people understand that once something becomes official, it takes on a life of its own. A report exists, a record is created, and even if it's later proven wrong, it still leaves a trail. It still creates friction. It still costs time, money, and energy to undo. The HOA knew that involving law enforcement would escalate the situation without them having to confront me directly. It allowed them to stay behind the scenes while the weight of authority did the talking. And that distance gave their claim a seriousness it didn't deserve. This is where the story converts casual viewers into invested on, because it taps into a universal fear. Not being heard by the very systems meant to protect fairness. The idea that truth can be sidelined, not intentionally but incidentally, because procedure comes first. What's infuriating is how reasonable everything looks on the surface. The officers explain that they're not making a judgment. They're not deciding ownership. They're simply responding to a complaint. They advise legal resolution. They suggest documentation. They follow the script. And yet, that script creates real consequences. It validates the HOA's decision to escalate. It signals that their claim is serious enough to warrant attention. It turns a baseless assertion into a recognized dispute. That's when it becomes clear. This is no longer about correcting an error. It's about navigating a system that treats all claims as potentially equal until proven otherwise. And proving otherwise takes time. Time during which pressure builds. The frustration intensifies because the system feels neutral, but neutrality in the face of falsehood doesn't feel neutral at all. It feels like imbalance. Like standing still while someone else moves pieces around the board. Viewers feel that imbalance instinctively. They don't need legal expertise to understand it. They know what it's like to be told, this is just how the process works, even when the process seems to reward the wrong behavior. They know how powerless it can feel to be advised to work it out in court when you didn't. Create the conflict to begin with. The outrage isn't directed at law enforcement. It's directed at the misuse of authority, at the idea that systems can be nudged, prodded, and activated by people acting in bad faith. that someone can force you into defense mode simply by knowing which levers to pull. And the HOA kept pulling them. Each step was calculated to increase pressure without increasing visibility. Reports, notices, requests for compliance, each one framed as routine, reasonable, procedural, each one adding weight to a claim that still hadn't been proven. This is where the test becomes clear. Not a test of ownership, but a test of credibility. Who appears more legitimate on paper? Who fits more neatly into the system's expectations? A structured organization with letterhead and titles, or an individual insisting on history? That's a deeply uncomfortable question, because the answer isn't always the one we want. Systems are built to manage organizations. They're less comfortable with individuals who don't fit predefined categories. And that discomfort can create blind spots. The HOA was counting on that. They weren't trying to win outright. They were trying to wear me down, to make resistance costly, to make compliance feel like the easier option. That's how authority becomes a tool rather than a safeguard. The escalation doesn't come with sirens or arrests. It comes with paperwork multiplying, with meetings being scheduled, with deadlines being set, with the subtle implication that non-cooperation could lead to further action, and all of it wrapped in language that sounds reasonable. That's what makes it so effective and so infuriating. Viewers stay engaged because they sense the unfairness even if they can't articulate it yet. They feel the stakes rising not through physical danger, but through institutional momentum. They understand that once authority is pointed in a direction, it takes effort to redirect it, even when it's wrong. This phase of the story isn't about confrontation, it's about endurance, about resisting the urge to react emotionally while recognizing that inaction isn't an option. It's about realizing that the system won't automatically correct itself just because the truth exists. The outrage deepens as it becomes clear that the HOA's confidence is growing. Each official response reinforces their belief that they're untouchable, that if the system is responding to them, they must be right, or at least close enough. That belief is dangerous, because it encourages escalation. It emboldens people to push further, to make bigger claims, to involve more authority, and each step raises the cost of reversal. For viewers, this is the point of no return. The story is no longer about whether the claim is false. They know it is. It's about whether truth can survive contact with a system that doesn't prioritize it automatically. And that question keeps them watching, because the answer matters far beyond this one ranch. By the time the meeting was announced, the tension had settled into something heavier than anger. It was expectation. The HOA framed it as a resolution point, a final discussion, a chance to clarify misunderstandings and bring matters to a close. On paper it sounded reasonable, neutral, even cooperative, but the subtext was unmistakable. This was where they believed the story would end. They thought the HOA meeting would end the dispute. I treated it like a courtroom with receipts. From the moment the notice arrived, everything changed, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. This was no longer about responding to letters or correcting records behind the scenes. This was a public moment, a controlled environment where narratives would collide in front of witnesses. And that made preparation everything. Countdown psychology kicks in here because viewers feel it instinctively. A date has been set. A room has been reserved. People will be present. Decisions will be made in real time. There's no pause button once it starts. Whatever happens in that room will shape what comes next. The HOA believed this setting favored them. It was their space, their agenda, their procedures, their rules of order. They were comfortable there. They had done this before. Meetings were where they exercised authority, passed motions, and reaffirmed control. They assumed familiarity equaled advantage. What they didn't realize was that familiarity breeds complacency. While they prepared talking points, I prepared evidence. Not to argue, not to interrupt, not to make a scene, but to present, calmly, methodically, the way facts speak loudest when they're allowed to stand on their own. The days leading up to the meeting weren't dramatic. No confrontations, no threats, just quiet organization, documents laid out in sequence, timelines aligned, cross-references checked, each piece chosen not for volume but for clarity. Not to overwhelm, but to corner the truth into a space where it couldn't be ignored. Viewers stay engaged here because they sense the shift from defense to intention. This isn't someone hoping to be heard. This is someone planning to be undeniable. The night of the meeting, the room fills slowly. Familiar faces, board members taking their seats, residents murmuring to each other. Some curious, some skeptical, some already convinced of a version of events they've been told repeatedly. That's important because it raises the stakes. Minds aren't empty here, they're occupied. The HOA opens the meeting the way they always do. Formalities, minutes, approvals, routine. That routine is part of their confidence. It reinforces the idea that this is just another administrative matter, another item to be handled and checked off. Then the issue comes up. They speak first, calm, polished. They summarize their position as if it's already established fact. They reference documents. They cite authority. They frame the dispute as unfortunate but necessary. Language designed to sound reluctant rather than aggressive, reasonable rather than opportunistic. And for a moment, it works. You can feel the room leaning toward acceptance, not because people understand the details, but because the delivery feels familiar, organized, confident. That's how authority often operates, not by being right, but by sounding settled. This is where anticipation peaks. Viewers know what's coming, but not how it will land. They're watching the setup stretch, wondering when the interruption will happen, when the confrontation will spark. But it doesn't come the way they expect. No raised voice, no accusations, just a request to speak. The shift is subtle but immediate. The room's attention changes direction, not because of drama, but because something different is happening. The tone isn't defensive, it isn't emotional, it's controlled. What follows isn't an argument, it's a presentation, one document at a time, introduced in context, explained plainly, not legal jargon, but clear logic, dates aligned, claims matched against records, references checked against public filings, each point building on the last, not to overwhelm, but to create a narrative the room can follow. This is where treating the meeting like a courtroom matters. Courtrooms aren't about volume, they're about sequence. Evidence doesn't shout, it accumulates, and accumulation is devastating to false confidence. Viewers stay glued because this is the payoff they've been waiting for. Delivered slowly enough to savor. Each revelation isn't explosive, it's undeniable. The kind of realization that spreads across a room quietly, as people start glancing at each other, recalculating what they thought they knew. The HOA's earlier certainty begins to falter, not outwardly at first. They maintain composure, but you can see it in the pauses, in the way responses become less specific, in how explanations start referencing process rather than substance. That's a critical moment, because it reveals the difference between authority and truth. Authority speaks comfortably until challenged. Truth speaks carefully because it expects scrutiny. As more documents are presented, the story the HOA relied on starts collapsing inward, not through accusation but through comparison. Their claims placed side by side with verifiable records, their dates measured against public timelines, their boundaries contrasted with surveyed realities. The room isn't hostile, it's attentive. That's worse for the HOA, because attention means people are thinking, and once people start thinking, repetition loses its power. The familiar narrative doesn't feel as solid anymore. It starts to feel rehearsed. This is where countdown psychology fully pays off. Every minute feels consequential. Viewers understand that momentum has shifted, but they don't know where it will land. Will the board push back? Will they shut it down? Will they defer? Or will something break? The HOA attempts to end control by invoking procedure, time limits, agendas, deferrals. But procedure can't erase what's already been shown. Once evidence is seen, it exists. And trying to contain it only highlights its impact. The confrontation never becomes loud. That's what makes it powerful. It remains civil, structured, almost restrained, which forces the HOA to respond in the same register. They can't dismiss it as emotional or disruptive. They have to engage or appear evasive. Viewers feel the satisfaction building not because someone is winning, but because clarity is emerging. The fog that once protected the false claim is lifting, not abruptly, but steadily, and steady revelations are harder to refute. By the time the meeting reaches its later stages, the energy in the room has shifted completely. Questions start coming from residents, not hostile ones, curious ones. Requests for clarification, requests for verification, the kind of questions that signal trust is being redistributed. That's the turning point. Not a vote, not a declaration, just a change in who the room believes deserves answers. The HOA thought this meeting would end the dispute because they believed control of the room meant control of the outcome. They didn't account for preparation. They didn't expect the narrative to be challenged so thoroughly, so calmly, so publicly. Viewers stay until the end of this section because they sense that something irreversible has happened. Even if no decision is made yet, even if nothing is officially resolved, the balance has shifted. Once doubt enters collectively, it doesn't leave easily. And that's the brilliance of this moment. The payoff isn't a dramatic victory, it's the collapse of certainty. The realization that the story everyone was told no longer holds. And once that happens, control becomes impossible to maintain. The meeting doesn't end with applause or outrage, it ends with silence. The kind of silence that follows understanding. And that silence tells viewers everything they need to know. The dispute didn't end here, but the outcome was decided. The moment of reversal didn't arrive with a bang. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, no line crossed that would later be replayed for shock value. In fact, if you weren't paying close attention, you might have missed it entirely. That's what made it so powerful. Power didn't change hands because someone seized it. It changed hands because it quietly let go of the wrong people. No yelling, no threats, just facts, presented publicly, until the room understood who had really been lying. At first, nothing looked different. The same people were sitting in the same seats. The same agenda lay on the table. The same rules technically applied. But something intangible had shifted. Authority, W. Hish had once felt solid and unquestioned, now felt conditional, fragile, like it needed permission to speak. That's the climax most people don't expect, not confrontation, but clarity. As the facts settled into the room, they did something arguments never could. They removed options. The HOA could deny, but denial now required explaining inconsistencies. They could deflect, but deflection only drew more attention to what had already been exposed. They could stay silent, but silence, after so much confidence, spoke louder than any rebuttal. What's satisfying for viewers here isn't humiliation. It's recognition. The quiet acknowledgement that truth doesn't need to dominate to prevail, it only needs space. The people who had relied on authority suddenly found themselves relying on explanations. And explanations are harder to maintain than assertions. Assertions ask to be believed. Explanations ask to be tested. That distinction matters. One by one, the pillars of the HOA's narrative weakened. Not because someone attacked them, but because they were no longer holding weight. Claims that once sounded decisive now felt tentative. Language that once projected certainty began to soften. Words like definitely and clearly gave way to possibly and as we understand it. That linguistic shift is subtle but devastating. Viewers feel it instinctively. They know that when people start qualifying statements they once declared boldly, something has gone wrong for the people in power. And still there's no gloating, no victory lap, no effort to embarrass anyone. That restraint is critical, because it keeps the focus exactly where it belongs, on the facts. This is where satisfaction replaces outrage. Viewers aren't watching someone get revenge. They're watching someone reclaim balance, and balance feels just. Revenge feels messy. Justice feels earned. The room doesn't erupt. It recalibrates. Questions are no longer directed outward, toward the person being accused. They turn inward toward the people who made the accusations. Not hostile questions, curious ones, clarifying ones. The kind that reveal trust has shifted. That's power reversal in its purest form. When the audience, the room, the community, decides who deserves scrutiny, the HOA tries to regain footing by emphasizing procedure, votes, committees, future reviews, but procedure no longer commands automatic respect, not after the facts have spoken. Now procedure sounds like delay, not governance, and people can feel the difference. This is where patience proves itself as strength, because none of this happens quickly. It unfolds in layers. Each layer reinforces the last. Each unanswered question compounds the doubt, and doubt, once shared publicly, is impossible to contain. The people who once felt intimidated by titles and structure begin to relax. They lean back. They exchange looks, not because they're enjoying someone else's discomfort, but because something that felt wrong finally makes sense. That's justice without spectacle. Viewers stay emotionally engaged because the resolution aligns with something deeply human, the desire for fairness without cruelty, the idea that wrongdoing can be exposed without turning into chaos, that someone can win without becoming what they're fighting. The HOA's authority doesn't collapse, it dissolves, and dissolution is more permanent than destruction. You can rebuild after destruction. It's much harder to rebuild after trust evaporates. By the end of the exchange, no one needs to say who was lying. The room already knows. And when a collective reaches that understanding independently, it carries more weight than any declaration ever could. What makes this climax so effective is that it doesn't demand emotional investment. It rewards it. Viewers who stayed through the slow build get to see intelligence pay off. They get to see preparation matter. They get to see that restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And perhaps most importantly, they get to see that power doesn't always change hands through force. Sometimes it changes hands because the wrong people can no longer justify holding it. That's the kind of ending that lingers, not because it's loud, but because it feels right. When everything finally settled, when the meetings stopped feeling like battlegrounds and the paperwork stopped arriving with implied threats, the most surprising part wasn't relief, it was clarity. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from understanding why the fight mattered in the first place. I didn't take over the HOA to win. I did it to make sure no one else lost their home the same way. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, in the quiet moments after the conflict faded, in the absence of urgency, in the space where anger used to live. Because once the pressure lifts, you're left alone with the meaning of what just happened. And meaning is harder to process than adrenaline. At first, people congratulated me. They framed it as a victory, a takeover, a reversal of power. Those words never sat right. Winning implies a game. This wasn't a game. This was about stability, about preventing something deeply wrong from happening again. That's what makes the aftermath so important for retention. Viewers aren't just watching how a story ends, they're watching what it becomes. They want to know whether the outcome justified the struggle, whether anything lasting came from it, whether the experience changed something beyond one person's circumstances, and it did. Once the HOA's narrative collapsed, something else became visible, how vulnerable everyone else had been the entire time. Neighbors who had paid fees without ever seeing records. Families who assumed oversight existed because it was implied. People who trusted that structure equaled safety. None of them were careless. They were normal, busy, reasonable. And that's the uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind. Fraud, overreach, and abuse don't thrive on ignorance. They thrive on trust. That's where reflection replaces triumph. Taking over the HOA wasn't about control, it was about responsibility, about recognizing that walking away would leave the same system intact, just temporarily embarrassed, and embarrassment fades, structures remain. The choice wasn't between winning and losing, it was between disengaging and correcting. That distinction matters deeply to viewers because it reframes power. Power isn't portrayed as dominance but as stewardship. Not the ability to impose will, but the willingness to prevent harm. That's why the ending resonates, because it refuses to celebrate ego. It centers accountability. Once transparency replaced intimidation, people began asking questions they'd never thought to ask before. Where does the money go? Who audits this? What authority actually exists here? Those questions didn't come from fear, they came from awareness. And awareness is contagious. This is where viewers begin projecting the story onto their own lives, their own neighborhoods, their own associations, their own assumptions. The comment sections fill up not with applause, but with recognition. This could happen anywhere. I've never seen our HOA's records. We just trust them. That's retention-friendly storytelling because it extends beyond the video. It lingers. The lesson isn't fight back harder, it's pay attention earlier. It's understanding that systems don't protect people by default, they protect processes. And when processes go unchecked, people get hurt quietly. The most meaningful outcome wasn't control of the HOA, it was restoring a sense of safety, knowing that no one would wake up to an accusation backed by authority they couldn't question, knowing that records were open, decisions documented, power distributed. That's not dramatic, it's responsible, and responsibility rarely gets celebrated, but it gets respected. Viewers who stay until the end aren't looking for fireworks, they're looking for reassurance. Reassurance that doing the right thing, even slowly and quietly, can still matter. That intelligence and patience aren't just survival tools, they're corrective ones. The story closes not with a declaration, but with an invitation to look closer, to ask questions, to understand that stability isn't something you assume, it's something you maintain. That's why people share it. Not because it's entertaining, but because it's instructive without being preachy. It doesn't say, be afraid, it says, be aware. And awareness, once gained, doesn't fade easily. In the end, the real victory wasn't authority, it was prevention. Making sure that what happened once couldn't quietly happen again. Making sure that paperwork served people, not the other way around. That's the kind of ending that doesn't shout. It stays with you.